Within 48 hours of securing a parliamentary majority, the leader of a G7 nation suspended a national tax, invited 100 of the world's most powerful investors to a summit, and told his country openly that its closest ally had become its biggest economic threat. And Washington had no response ready. Because nobody in the White House had calculated for this. Mark Carney's first 30 days with a majority government were not what Donald Trump expected. And the full picture of what actually happened in those weeks reveals something much larger than a political milestone. It reveals a strategic architecture being built quietly, methodically, right next door. And the question that matters now, the one we will come back to before this is over, is whether Washington even understands yet what has been constructed. To understand what Carney's majority actually means, you have to understand what he was operating without for the entire year before it. Since winning Canada's federal election in April 2025, Carney's Liberal government held a minority in the House of Commons. That means every significant piece of legislation, every budget, every meaningful vote required negotiation with opposition parties. The Bloc Québécois, the NDP, even the Conservatives at times. Carney had to bargain, to compromise, to give ground just to govern. In November 2025, his budget passed by a margin of only 2 votes after weeks of backroom negotiations that included personal assurances to the lone Green Party MP. That is not a foundation from which you build long-term strategy. That is a foundation from which you survive. But on the night of April 13th, 2026, that changed. The Liberal Party swept all 3 ridings in a set of special by-elections, winning in Toronto's University Rosedale, Scarborough Southwest, and the closely contested Quebec riding of Terrebonne. Combined with 5 floor crossings from opposition MPs over the preceding months, 4 from the Conservatives and 1 from the NDP, the Liberals reached 174 seats in the 343-seat House of Commons. It was the first time in Canadian history that a government switched from minority to majority status between national elections. That is not just a political footnote. That is a structural transformation in governing power. And what is particularly telling is who helped cause it. One of the Conservative floor crossers cited Carney's speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos as a factor in his decision to cross the aisle. That means an opposing party's own member looked at Carney's vision for Canada, a vision built on strategic autonomy, diversification, and resistance to economic coercion, and concluded it was more credible than what his own party was offering. That is a remarkable statement about the political moment Canada finds itself in. Now, what Washington had expected from all of this is important context. The conventional assumption in the Trump administration and in much of American political media was that Carney's minority position made him vulnerable, that he was constrained, that the pressure of tariffs, the annexation rhetoric, and the economic unpredictability of a second Trump term would eventually force Canada into a more compliant posture. Howard Lutnick, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, dismissed Carney's trade diversification strategy in blunt terms during an appearance at a Washington forum. Lutnick said Canada has the worst trade strategy he had ever heard, questioning whether China would buy Canadian goods and mocking the decision to accept Chinese electric vehicles as part of a trade arrangement. That is the framing Washington was operating from. Canada as a junior partner making bad decisions out of desperation. That framing did not survive contact with April 14th, 2026. What happened instead was something the White House had not fully modeled. Carney did not just win a majority. He won it while being publicly attacked by the most powerful man in the world. And his response to finally having that majority was not to pause, not to celebrate, not to consolidate cautiously. He moved immediately in ways that were direct, visible, and designed to be noticed. Within 24 hours of the by-election results, Carney held a press conference not to talk about his political victory, but to talk about policy. And the policy he led with was not trade, not diplomacy, not constitutional authority. It was gasoline. He announced a temporary suspension of the federal excise tax on gasoline and diesel, citing the sharp rise in fuel costs driven by the ongoing Iran war. That decision is more strategic than it first appears, and understanding why requires a brief detour into what is happening with global energy. The conflict involving Iran and its impact on oil markets through the Strait of Hormuz has driven Canadian gasoline prices up roughly 45% in 2026. Carney framed the tax suspension as a responsible, temporary measure that would reduce gasoline costs by 10 Canadian cents per liter and diesel by 4 cents, effective April 20th through Labor Day on September 7th. The total cost to the federal treasury is approximately 2.4 billion Canadian dollars. That is real money, and Carney did not pretend otherwise. But the political and economic logic of the move is layered. First, it is tangible affordability relief at exactly the moment Canadians are feeling economic stress from multiple directions. Second, it signals that a majority government acts differently than a minority one, that it can make consequential decisions quickly without months of negotiation. And third, perhaps most importantly in the context of the U.S.-Canada relationship, it draws a deliberate contrast. At the same moment that American consumers were absorbing rising fuel costs with no equivalent federal relief, Canada was cutting pump prices for truckers, farmers, and families. Carney did not say this out loud. He did not need to. The data said it for him. And that contrast, quiet but visible, is characteristic of how this government has chosen to operate. But the fuel tax decision was only the first move, because what Carney did next was not reactive at all. It was forward-looking in a way that revealed the scale of the agenda he had been holding in reserve. According to reporting from CBC News, Carney sent invitations to 100 of the world's biggest investment firms for a summit in Toronto this September, a conference aimed at unlocking trillions of dollars in capital investment in Canada. Think about what that means structurally. The Prime Minister of a country of 40 million people, 1 week after securing a parliamentary majority, is convening the largest gathering of global private capital in Canadian history. He is not asking for trade concessions. He is not waiting for Washington to change its posture. He is building an alternative architecture of economic relationships, institution by institution, investor by investor, dollar by dollar. The Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, which will host the meeting, described the pitch as selling Canada as a reliable, safe destination for capital in an increasingly unstable world, summarizing it simply as, "Canada is cool again." That phrase is worth pausing on. It is not the language of a country on the defensive. It is the language of a country that has decided to compete. And the competition it is entering is not primarily with the United States. It is for the confidence of global capital at a moment when investors everywhere are reassessing risk, reassessing reliability, and reassessing which governments can actually deliver on their promises. Carney has also set a specific, measurable target: doubling Canada's non-U.S. exports to 300 billion Canadian dollars over the next decade. That is the kind of commitment that either gets tested and held against you, or it becomes the organizing principle of an entire national economic strategy. From what Carney has done since the majority was secured, it appears to be the latter. What makes the investment summit and the export target genuinely significant is the context in which they are being pursued. This is not a pivot away from the United States in the sense of a rupture or a withdrawal. Canada's economic integration with America is deep, structural, and not reversible on any short timeline. Roughly 75% of Canadian exports still go to the United States. Carney himself acknowledged this plainly, stating that many of Canada's former strengths, based on close ties to America, have become weaknesses that must be corrected. That is not isolationist language. That is risk management language. It is the language of a central banker, not a politician, and that distinction matters enormously. Carney is not pursuing diversification as an ideological project. He is pursuing it because the concentration of economic dependency in a single unpredictable partner represents a systemic vulnerability that a responsible government cannot ignore. The Invest in Canada Summit is one instrument in that strategy. The Canada-Mexico Action Plan, signed in 2025 and deepening ahead of the USMCA review, is another. The 12 trade and security agreements signed on 4 continents in the first year of his government are another. And the USMCA review itself, now less than 3 months away, is the biggest instrument of all. The USMCA, the trade agreement governing commerce between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, is subject to a mandatory joint review that must be confirmed in writing by all three parties by July 1, 2026. If all parties do not confirm renewal, a 10-year countdown to the agreement's expiry begins. That is the framework within which Carney's majority government must now negotiate, and the stakes of that negotiation cannot be overstated. The automotive sector alone represents $30 billion in annual trade between Canada and the United States. Grain and agricultural products, energy, critical minerals, advanced manufacturing, all of it governed by the terms of this agreement. The U.S. Supreme Court's recent ruling that struck down the administration's broadest tariff authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act has modestly but meaningfully reduced the credibility of large, rapid tariff threats from Washington. That ruling did not eliminate American leverage, but it changed the negotiating calculus, and it changed it in ways that benefit Carney's position heading into the most consequential trade negotiation of his tenure. Here is where speculation is appropriate, though it must be clearly labeled as such. Based on Carney's public statements, the structure of his government's actions since the majority was secured, and the pattern of Canadian diplomacy over the past year, it appears that Carney's strategy going into the USMCA review is to negotiate from a position of visible alternatives rather than visible need. The Investment Summit, the Trade Diversification Roadshow, the Canada-Mexico Coordination, all of it can be read as a message to Washington that Canada is not waiting for American predictability to return before it builds a more resilient economy. Whether that message is received, and whether it modifies American behavior at the negotiating table, is genuinely uncertain. What is known is that Carney has described the review himself as one that will be robust, telling reporters that the president is a strong negotiator and that some of the critical comments from Washington should be viewed in the context of the upcoming USMCA talks. That is careful, measured language. It is the kind of framing a negotiator uses when they want to keep doors open while maintaining their position. What the opposition has made of all this is itself revealing. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's response to the majority was not a policy critique. It was a legitimacy challenge. Poilievre claimed Carney's majority was the product of backroom deals and undemocratic arrangements, arguing the government was seeking total power without accountability. That framing has not resonated broadly. Polling from Nanos Research showed Carney leading Poilievre on the preferred prime minister question by 31 points at the time the majority was secured. The floor crosses who joined the Liberals came with explanations rooted in policy and national interest, not patronage. And the by-election results themselves told a stark story about conservative support in urban and suburban Canada, with the party's vote share collapsing from 30% to 18% in Scarborough Southwest and from 24% to 12% in University Rosedale in the space of a single year. The Conservatives dropped to third place in University Rosedale, behind the NDP. These are not the numbers of a party in a strong position to hold the government accountable, whatever the rhetoric suggests. But accountability is a genuine and important question, and it deserves honest treatment. The risks of a majority government are real. CBC News analysis noted two risks for Carney in the majority era: complacency and moving further or faster than Canadians are ready to accept. Both risks are credible. The complacency risk is minimized somewhat by the fact that the external pressure from tariffs, the Iran war energy shock, and the USMCA deadline provide a continuous operational urgency that makes standing still politically untenable. The overreach risk is more nuanced. Carney has already faced accusations of legislative overreach in the minority parliament. With a majority, those accusations will intensify whenever he moves quickly. Government House Leader Steve McKinnon acknowledged this directly, vowing that the Liberals would act as unifiers rather than exploiting their numerical advantage. Whether that commitment holds under the pressure of a complex USMCA negotiation and a challenging global economic environment is something that can only be evaluated over time. What can be evaluated now is the record of the first week since the majority was secured. The fuel tax suspension was enacted. The Invest in Canada Summit invitations were sent. A national video address was released in which Carney told Canadians plainly that the era of assuming American reliability is over. He said, "We have to take care of ourselves because we cannot rely on one foreign partner." He committed to never sugarcoating the challenges. He described Canada as a country that will build from strength rather than wait for rescue. These are not the words of a leader positioning himself for a quiet second term. They are the words of someone who believes the window for consequential action is open right now and who intends to use it. The IMF's April 2026 economic outlook added independent validation to that posture. The IMF projected Canada would be the second fastest growing economy in the G7 in both 2026 and 2027, behind only the United States. For a country that has been told repeatedly by its southern neighbor that it cannot survive without American goodwill, that projection is both economically significant and politically useful. Carney referenced it directly and immediately. That is not accidental. It is a reminder, delivered in the language of institutional credibility, that Canada is not a dependent, it is a peer. So what does all of this add up to, and what should viewers take away from Carney's first 30 days as a majority prime minister? The honest answer is that we are watching the early construction of a strategy whose full consequences will take years to become clear. The USMCA review in July will be the first major test. The Invest in Canada Summit in September will be the second. The question of whether Canada can genuinely double its non-U.S. exports over a decade without sacrificing the integration that still makes its economy function is a third. None of these have resolved yet. What has resolved is the structural question of whether Carney has the political authority to pursue this agenda. He does. A majority government with a potential runway until 2029, built from a combination of electoral victory, strategic floor crossings, and a public that has consistently chosen his approach to the Trump era over the alternatives, is a real foundation. It is not unlimited. No political foundation is. But it is more than anyone in Washington predicted when Carney first took office 13 months ago as a political rookie inheriting a fractured party. The man who ran 2 central banks before he ran for office has now demonstrated that he can also run the political mechanics of a parliamentary system under sustained pressure. What he builds with that capacity over the coming months, and whether Washington adjusts its assumptions accordingly, is the story that comes next.